Okay, so it's 4:02. I think we're going to get started. This is the second session of this fish and chips thingy, and if I can share my screen somehow, then share. Yes, so you should see my screen. And I need to make sure that I still see if someone comes in. That would be helpful. So now I don't see anything anymore of my content. Great. I have a presentation that I've prepared, but I would also like to, we'll see how far we get, but I would also like to use Visual Studio Code a little bit and start looking at some stuff. This is still, or at least I still consider it introduction. And so we're not going to make a template, a real folder with a template today. But I am going to talk a little bit about the basic technology. That is what I want to focus on. So before we do that, I said last time that there was a forum.callassoftware.com. I put also now it's too late, but because you're already here. But I put a topic there for session 2. I will do the same for other sessions, and those will each time contain the direct Zoom link if you don't find it anywhere else. So I will put that there. If you have questions or remarks at the end, don't hesitate and just make a post there or a reaction to the session 2 topic, and then I will do my best to see that and answer on these things. As I said, I'm going to be using Visual Studio Code, and there are a few things that I use and that maybe you should think about using as well. And that is modules. I think I did a session about JavaScript a long time ago, and I talked about those things then as well. It hasn't changed all that much. The only addition that I think I use now, which you probably should think about, is the last one there, Copilot. You don't have to do it. Life goes on without AI, so that is not really the issue. But Copilot is useful for creating a framework of an HTML file or a CSS file or something like that. And that I find very, very useful. And it's actually grown quite a bit over time, as I'm sure you all know by now. So that is something that I think is useful. The other thing, and for these templates that we're using for pdfToolbox, they consist out of a folder of stuff. And so knowing that in Visual Studio Code, and I still see too many people not using that, and it's a shame, knowing that you can open a complete folder and see all the folders and subfolders underneath and so on, and edit all the files in there is very useful. It has become even more useful now that you have Copilot, because Copilot can then very easily access all the files you have in that folder and refer to different files. And that is a very, very useful thing. So if I look at my Visual Studio Code, so if I start that, what I typically do, and it is small, but you see what's going on. What I typically do is I just have the main folder of what then will become the templates in there. So what I was saying is that I always have the folder in there, but it also means that now if I would go to Copilot, and you have a way to, if you have it installed, you have a way to open a chat there it has a much easier time to access all of these files that you have in that folder, and that can be very helpful. So there are three things, unfortunately, and before the meeting, I was talking a little bit with Damiano, and I think we have the same opinion about all these underlying technologies, and it's not always a very great opinion. There are three technologies that you have to use to make a template, and you have to use all of them because otherwise it doesn't make any sense. You have HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And the difficulty or the learning curve is that it's not just some JavaScript that you have to master, but you also have to understand how HTML and CSS work, because it's really the only way you can make a template that looks exactly the way you want and that generates the PDF exactly the way you want. And so I would think that most of you have a basic understanding of these things. I've noticed that there is almost no one left who knows what HTML stands for. We all know what it does, but um, it's getting old, I guess. So it was conceived as a markup language, and I think the important thing is not so much that it was invented by a physicist. I'm not even sure he was a physicist. He worked at CERN, but that is not the important part. The important part is that the HTML part does most of the structure. I say it doesn't include form or style. That is not entirely true. HTML elements in a browser typically have a default look and feel, and so you can call that form or style as well. And then there are certainly areas where you can modify the way the HTML looks, and that modifies what you're going to get to see on screen. But the main purpose of the HTML in the story is structure. What do I want? Do I want a bunch of rectangles with that can contain text? Do I want different columns? Do I want a heading? Do I want a paragraph? HTML was invented to capture the structure of your document. And in a way, it follows a very common development thing, which is a model view controller model. So you separate the model, the data, from the way the data is represented or styled, the view, and from the things that happen to the data, which is the controller. And that is what they tried, at least with HTML and CSS as well. And I don't think they entirely succeeded in it, but they at least tried to do it. The styling and the whole idea of the styling, but maybe before we do that, I did something with, or I tried Visual Studio Code to accomplish a thing here, this thing. So what you can do if you happen to have Copilot, and just because you want to have something to play with at some point, is you can ask Copilot, give me a basic HTML framework or basic HTML file. In the past, I would have probably gone to the internet and download something, but Copilot is actually quite good at doing these things. And it works for HTML, but it also works for CSS, and then also customizations that you may be wanting to do. And then it will provide something to me, and then I think I can just click here and say, save that somewhere, and then I would need to figure out where this thing lives. So let's just put it under here, and then let's call it index.html. And so that gives me an HTML file that I can play with. Now, I'll talk about specifically pdfToolbox based HTML and so on a little bit later, But what is important is that what pdfToolbox uses is standard HTML and CSS and JavaScript. There are additions, there are things that you can do that a browser would not be able to do, would not recognize. But this is standard HTML. This will work in a browser, and it will also work in the place content technology in pdfToolbox, and it will work in pdfChip and so on. And so when I view that, it gives me something that actually works. Yeah. So there's nothing special here. And when I talked about structure, what I mostly mean is, well, you have certain content elements here. This is a header and this is a paragraph. This doesn't really tell you how that is supposed to look. It just says I have a header and a paragraph. And when I go to preview on a Mac and I watch that thing, then the view here is a default view for a header and a piece of text. And if I want something else, I have to figure out how I change the styling of those HTML elements. But the HTML by itself doesn't really tell me what the styling is. I need something else for that. And so that brings us to CSS, which stands for another thing that no one still remembers. And it's actually not a bad name. It's Cascading Style Sheet. And the reason it's Cascading Style Sheet is, well, first of all, it's a style sheet. So a style sheet meaning a way of defining what the different elements in my HTML should look like. But it's called cascading for a number of reasons. First of all, CSS files can contain a list of rules, and these rules are evaluated from top to bottom. So essentially, if you have a rule that says this element will be red or should be red, and then a little bit later, I have another rule that says this element should be purple, then it's going to be purple in the end. They are evaluated starting at the top and then they go down. That's not the only reason they're called cascading. They're also called cascading because these rules define which elements are styled. And that typically goes from very wide, things like I want to style everything, or I want to make all paragraph text red. So it goes from very wide and very open to much more focused, where you say, I want to look at all elements that have a certain ID or that have a certain class or that have, and I want to change the color of these elements, but not of anything else. Yeah, so it goes from top to bottom, and it typically goes from very broad rules to much more specific rules for certain elements. Now, that sounds very simple, but in practice, it can be a bit of a nightmare. And maybe we need to introduce two concepts in on the HTML side that we're going to very often use in CSS. And that is, the first thing is that for each of these elements that I have, so I have this H1 thing, which is a header of level 1, and I have the P thing, which is a paragraph. Each of these things can have attributes, and these attributes can help you work with them. And sometimes they change options. Sometimes they are just there because they can be referenced from CSS afterwards. And so what I could do is I could say this is H1, and the ID of this thing is, this is my, look, this is Copilot. It always knows what I'm going to do. So this is the main heading there, right? And for the text, what I could do is I could give that a class, and I'll tell you what the difference is. And Copilot says this should be called description. Let's go with that. I don't want to type too much. So each of these elements I can tag with parameters. And these parameters can either have an inherent inherent meaning. They can mean something in HTML already, or they can be something that I put in there because I know that I'm going to use it from CSS afterwards. The two most common ones for styling with CSS probably are ID and class. What's the difference? Well, IDs are supposed to be unique. So if I have an ID main heading and I assign that to this header, then I'm supposed to not have any other element in my HTML that has the same ID. Yeah, so an ID is a unique identification of one element in my HTML. A class is different. A class is just a tag. And so if I have 5 different paragraph thingies, then then it can perfectly well have the same class. That's not a problem. Why would you do that? Well, if I have let's say that I have a list of books, and each book has a title and it has an author and then it has a short description. I will probably come up with a class named author and a class named title and a class named description. And when I do that, when I tag all of the content in my HTML with these class names, then CSS will allow me to say, now look for every element that has this class title associated with it and make it 14 point, this particular font face, this particular color, and so on, right? So this has to be unique. Classes don't have to be unique. And classes actually, it is not that an element has one class. Elements can have as many classes as you want. So you can assign multiple classes to an element. And in CSS, that again gives you more ways that you can target and style these particular things. Now, to be very clear, we looked at this before. I can look at it again, right? Hasn't changed a thing. Why? Well, the only thing I've added is metadata to these elements, right? I haven't attached any styling. There is no CSS file in my folder. There is no CSS file referenced from here. So I haven't added any styling or modified any styling. I have just tagged certain elements in the HTML. And so what we now can do is say, okay, now I want to see what what we can do with CSS, and let's see if we can. Okay, let me see if I can get Copilot on here at a size that is usable. So I could say create a basic CSS file that makes text red. I don't know whether this is going to work. Text red and reference it from my index.html. I'm always surprised that things like this work. We'll see whether it works this time. So this is so I'm going to apply that to my HTML file, and then this one is going to ask me to create it, so that is also good. And then because it's Copilot and it's nice, it asks me to whether I want to keep this. And for both, we're going to say yes. So what happened here? Well, first of all, I created, or rather Copilot created for me, I created a new style.css file. And the basic way this looks is exactly this. There is only one style in there, but they all look the same. They have a name for the rule, and actually the name is also the element that it refers to. And then they have rules, properties that are being set. right? So that's how a CSS file is always going to look. You're going to have a collection of these rules. And I will make a few modifications in a second so that it is a little bit more clear, but I want to show how it's used in HTML first. And so if I go back to the HTML file that we were using, then what you can see is that there was one thing here that was added, and this is this link element. Link, and then the relationship of the link is a style sheet. So essentially, this element is a link to a style sheet, and then href, or rather the URL, is styles.css. It's a relative URL. It can be an absolute one, but in this case, it's a relative URL. So this element in my HTML essentially says, hold on, there is a style sheet I want you to use, and that style sheet is called styles.css, and it lives in the same folder as the HTML file itself. And I could put it in a subfolder, and typically that is what people do also. But in this case, it says it's right next to the HTML file. So that includes it in the HTML. And now hopefully if we go back to here and we watch this, what you can see is that all of the color of this thing has now changed and it's all red. Right? And that is because in the HTML, I included the styles. And in my style sheet, I say, you know what? For everything that is body, which is almost everything in CSS speak, I want you to change the property color, which is the foreground color of an element, to the color red. And actually, it's Visual Studio Code that shows me this patch. In reality, it just says color :red, right? And Visual Studio Code is nice enough to add something for me there. And by modifying the color, I can now change what happens. So if I say purple, then and I save this, then all my text should now be red, purple. Sorry. Yeah. So CSS contains the style. HTML just has to say, I want these styles to be used. Now, I am partially lying to you, but it's because I like you. I'm partially lying because you can, of course, include also style information in the HTML file itself. And then you don't need to bother with an external style sheet. And so I could say style and then, but they are all purple. So we want something that is going to be visible. So color green, let's see whether it likes that. And so now I have the purple that comes from my CSS file. So there is the general rule that everything will be purple. But as you can see, the last text line is now green. Why? Well, because that one has a style element in the text itself. Yeah. So the styling in the same format as you have it in a CSS can actually also be included in the HTML. I hate this. I hate that it's even possible. And I would implore you not to do it if you can avoid it. I understand why people do it, and I understand that sometimes it is attractive, but it becomes a complete mess. Yeah? The advantage of using HTML with IDs and classes and then using a style sheet, a separate file with a style sheet, is that these two things are separate. And if I want to make something where everything that is a P element and has a class that is description, if I want to make these things green, then I should do it in my CSS file because that will make it easier to maintain and easier to change afterwards. And so I could say, give me an additional rule, and in this additional rule, make the color green. This would change all of the P elements. That's not what I said. What I said was any element that has the class description, and CSS has a way, description has a way of doing that. And so if I now go to my HTML element, this is still purple because it is not a P element and it doesn't have a class. These have that class that I'm looking for, and they are also P elements. And so they become green. Yeah. Could I do it in here? Yes, but I would have had to modify both the first description element and the second one. So I would have had to add a style element to both of them. And then if I ever want to change my mind and make them purple or red or slightly bigger or anything like that, then I can't do it. I will have to again modify each element individually. And when you use an external style sheet, then you have a separate place where you manage these things. And you can add comments to this style sheet. You can order them in a way that looks logical to you, and so on and so on. All right. So if you have the chance, please do things the way they happen here. And that means link to an external style sheet. And you can link to as many style sheets as you want. You can also link to a bunch of other things. You can link to JavaScript, which is what we're going to talk about in a second as well. You can talk about or link to all these other things, but specifically for style sheets, you can link to as many style sheets as you want. Just remember that the name of these things is cascading style sheets. If you link them in, so if you have two separate style sheet files and you link them in a specific order, then the last one is going to get precedence over the first one, right? So if the second style sheet contains certain rules for certain elements, and the first style sheet also contained rules for the same type of element, then the last rule that you have overrides what comes before. I'm lying again. There are ways to make exceptions, but you don't want to know. Trust me. You also don't want to use it for sure. So HTML and CSS. And so if you ever want to, or if you get to the point that, and hopefully in the next session or so we will, but if we get to the point that we start making a template, then these what was I going to say? Yes. So if we get to the point that we're making a template, then there are going to be moments that you want to style very, very specific elements in your HTML. And so the examples that I have given with an ID that has to be unique and attributes that don't have to be unique, that's only two ways of identifying which elements you want to modify. Yeah, I have an example here with two classes in my HTML element. I can make a rule that says I want to style every element that has the class description and the class first, or a rule for every element that has the class description but not the class first. So you can play with multiple classes. I could also say I have a body element, give me the first paragraph element, P element in that body, or the second one, or give me the nth one or the last one. So there's a myriad of different ways to identify exactly which element um, you want to use or style. And if you think that those things are not used, look at the navigation structure of any website out there, the things with typically the lists that open and then submenus sometimes and whatever. The amount of CSS behind all of those is incredible. So yes, all of these different ways are used, and CSS files can become really, really, really complex if you're not careful. The advantage I think that we're going to have for pdfToolbox is that mostly these things I was gonna say they don't become too complex, but maybe I shouldn't say that. But you can avoid some of the complexity sometimes. So the last bit is JavaScript. And then I want to look at specific things for pdfToolbox with these three things. I'm not going to talk too much about JavaScript. I think you know what it is. Conceptually, it's a programming language. It is a very loose programming language, meaning you can do things that in most other programming languages you would be shoved out the door for and you would get all kinds of weird errors. JavaScript typically allows just about anything. It is untyped, meaning you don't have to declare what you're doing. If you create a variable, it could be a piece of text or a number or a list, and it can change halfway. So you can again do exactly what you want. Some people love that. Some people hate it. I do both. It's very, very useful and it can be very painful at the same time. It is the language where you can write things like 1 plus 1 is 11. And trust me, this is one of the simple examples. And this really does happen. Explaining JavaScript is much more work than what we can do here. If you're interested, when I was still at 4Ps, I did, I think in 2020 or so, I did an online class for JavaScript where we had 7 or 8 or something like that sessions that explained JavaScript to people who have never programmed, and certainly not in JavaScript. Um, it's 5 years ago or something, but that content is still useful and relevant. If you want to find that, then have a look at the YouTube channel for 4Ps, and there is a yeah, you'll find those videos still there. And of course, in the meantime, there are also lots and lots and lots of online resources for JavaScript. And luckily, ChatGPT, Copilot, any other virtual friend you may have also understands how to write JavaScript and can do that quite well. So HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. But the problem is that even if you know some of these things, then there are, well, no, especially if you have already done things with HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, or if you would look up things online, then you will find a lot of rules about what to do and what not to do. And I am here to tell you that most of those rules, when you're thinking about HTML and CSS and JavaScript in the context of pdfToolbox, you can, most of those rules are out the door. And in many cases, actually, the things that people will tell you not to do, you would better do because it's going to make your life a lot easier. And of course, that is because we're not making a website, we're making a PDF document. That is our ultimate result. In pdfChip, a completely new PDF document. In pdfToolbox, decorations that are going to be added on top of an existing PDF document. But in any case, we're making PDF content. And that is a different animal than making a website. And so a lot of the guidelines that are and common sense rules and so on that exist for websites don't exist for pdfToolbox or pdfChip based templates. So what are some of the changes? And I'm not sure this is complete. I thought it was, and then I thought of 2 more. There's probably others, but this is a good start. There is a concept in HTML. So we've talked about the fact that HTML contains elements. You have this paragraph element, for example, but you can also have boxes, like a div is a rectangular box. There are some things that that are used for styling, and they are part of the CSS model, but maybe the HTML model, and it's a bit all over the place. But there are 2 concepts, and you should at least remember them, and that is margins and padding. The black line that you have there is a div, so a box, and then I have a text element inside of it. The green is padding. So padding is on the inside of the box, and it is typically an area left in between the box element itself and any elements that are inside of the box. So that's padding. Think of a physical box. It is exactly the same. You have a box, you open it, in there you have cardboard or something else to protect what is inside. Yeah. So padding is in between the insides of the box and the box itself. The purple stuff is a margin, and a margin is on the outside of the box. So if you think about physical box and you're stacking them, the padding is never going to be in the way because it's on the inside. The margin would mean that if your physical boxes have a margin of 5 centimeter, it would mean that you cannot put them closer together than 5 centimeter, right? So it's also a form of white space, but it's on the outside of the box. And this is quite important also for coloring things and so on, because, for example, what you have on the inside, when you start playing with background colors and so on, whether something is margin or padding decides whether it takes on the background color or the foreground color and how it behaves in certain scenarios. So those two concepts exist. Not everyone will agree, but my solution for this, because this is a bit of a nightmare when you start doing calculations sometimes, my solution is very simple, and I'll at the end I'll show you a little CSS file that I typically use in place content templates. My solution is to set the margin and the padding to 0 for all elements in the file. Yeah, so I have a CSS file that says margin is 0, padding is 0, done. And then if I specifically want room between different elements, then I can set margin on that element or padding on that element. But by default, I set all of them at 0, and that makes calculations easier. Would I do that in an HTML file for a website? No, because that's a really bad idea. You have too many things that count on default margins and paddings. And so for a website, it's usually not a very good idea. But for place content templates, in many cases, it makes life just a lot easier calculation-wise. So you don't have to follow that, but I do. And then there is another thing that is that I adjust, and that is that what they call box sizing, or the sizing of the box model. And this also has to do with padding and margin, and it has to do with what the width and height properties mean. Yeah, by default, when you say that a box has a width of 100 pixels, I'm always confused, but I think that means that the padding is not included, so your actual box is bigger than 100 pixels, which is completely counterintuitive. If you think of a physical box, as I said, the physical box has padding on the inside, but a box of 50 centimeter is 50 centimeter. It is not 50 centimeter plus whatever the width of the padding happens to be on the inside. HTML says a box of 50 centimeter is 50 centimeter plus padding, and so my real box would actually be larger. That is enough to break anyone's mind. There is a way to switch this off and set it to the model that you would expect for physical objects, and I find that much easier. It's part of the CSS file that I will show you at the end. So I changed the default behavior for box sizing. This is actually also something I do for when I do something for websites, but certainly for pdfToolbox related stuff. Backgrounds are another point. In HTML for websites, essentially you don't really care what is generated. Ultimately, you're going to get pixels, your browser is going to display it, and browsers are very fast. And so you don't really care about optimization, you don't really care about color spaces, it's all RGB anyway. When you generate stuff in pdfToolbox or in pdfChip, you do care. And if you look at an element like this, which is a box with a black border, and then there is a little bit of text in there, what is that going to be generated as? Well, if you're not careful, what is going to be generated is a box that is, and I think I have that on the next slide. Yes, so the black box is going to be RGB black, yeah, unless you modify that. And there are ways in pdfChip or pdfToolbox to modify it so that you get CMYK. And that is still understandable that you have to modify it. But what also will happen if you're not careful is that your black box is not a black box. It's a black box with a white background, and the background is probably RGB white, yeah, because that's the default in a browser. Browsers do RGB. And so when I generate this in-place content and then pdfToolbox adds it on top of my existing PDF file, then what I'm ending up with is a nice CMYK PDF that now has decorations added to it that are RGB, and that's probably not what you want. Again, there's a way to fix that. You can set the background color of elements explicitly to CMYK, but you can also make them transparent, in which case they're not generated. And I have a rule in the CSS that I usually have that does exactly that. It switches the background to transparent so that you don't have to deal with it. And then if you have an element that you really want to have a background, you can generate the color that you want. You can generate it in CMYK or as a spot color or anything like that. The other difference is, a very big difference, is that when you're dealing with HTML, everyone will tell you that you should write HTML and CSS that is responsive, right? It should work on a computer, it should work on a cell phone. If I have an iPad, it has yet another screen size. So pages that are used to display information should be completely flexible and dynamic, and they should adjust to the space that you have. Think about what you're doing with pdfToolbox and pdfChip. You're generating either a new PDF document or you're adding to an existing document. You don't want to be flexible. You want to generate a specific size of page. And so CSS has a concept that is called paged media that is not used very often in websites. Perhaps it is used for when you generate a view that can be printed. Some services that allow you to download or to display an invoice, for example, in a format that makes it easier to print will use this. But normally on a website, paged media is not used. In these kinds of templates that we're going to make, you want to use it. And there are extensions to CSS even that the cChip technology understands that let you set not only the page size, but also the size of the trim box and the bleed box and the crop box and the media box and the art box if you really insist. So these things can be generated, and they should be generated in most cases. Page size is a particularly annoying thing when you start making templates for cChip because there is a default page size, which is A4, portrait A4, and you almost always have to change it because you're generating, yeah, content that is going to be used on an existing page or for a new PDF. And so if it's not A4 that you want, then you will have to do something about the default page size. So that is totally different. And what is also different and linked is if you want pages, if you want HTML that is dynamic and changes itself based on what medium it is displayed on, then you have to be very careful with the positioning of elements. HTML is a layout engine, and it can automatically reformat, resize, and so on page elements, right? So I'm watching something on the laptop, which has a wide screen. I have an HTML file that has 100 boxes with some stuff in it. Well, my HTML engine is capable of laying that out across the screen and filling the whole screen, or 90% of the width of the screen, or 80%, depending on how I build it. If I watch that same thing on my iPhone, then maybe instead of fitting 15 boxes horizontally, now I only fit 3 or 4 because the screen is much smaller. And that happens if you make the HTML correctly, it happens automatically. And that can be really helpful for cChip templates, but it can also be really annoying. If I'm creating an invoice, a template that will generate an invoice, I probably know that the logo of the company has to be in a specific spot at the top left of the generated PDF. And I want the footer to be at a specific spot just above the bottom of the document. So I know where these things are going to go. And the way to do that is that in CSS, you have something called absolute positioning. And it works exactly what you see on the slide. You can say, I want this object to be 20 millimeter to the left of another object and 15 millimeter to the top of another, or yeah, from the top of another object, for example. Yeah. And you have different parameters and measures that you can use, but you do absolute positioning. You tell the browser that um, the object needs to be there, regardless of screen size and all kinds of wrapping rules and whatever. No, the object has to be there. This is something that is very, very frequently used in at least my cChip templates because it's easy, and it is something that is almost never used on websites. Right? If you have an exam on making a website and you have to provide the HTML and CSS, using absolute positioning is probably the easiest way to get failed on that test. But you'll see that in cChip websites, it is used very often. You just have to be smart about it. Sometimes it is smart to say, I'm going to make a box and for that box, I'm going to use absolute positioning. So it ends up at a certain location of the page, but the elements inside of the box, I'm not going to do that. And I will let the layout engine of HTML handle that for me. And so the mix of these two things can be very powerful, but yeah, there are many cases where you end up with absolute positioning, where in a normal website, you would not have that. Two more things, and then we're kind of done if there are no questions. The first one is font face, or using fonts in general. So for a very long time, HTML has had the ability to use fonts. You can specify actual font files. You can also just specify a name, and then the browser does something that looks interesting. But you can specify actual font files. But because of the history involved, and because of the fact that there is not one browser, but there are 1,500, and things have changed over time and so on, there are a number of different online font formats. And you see two of them here, this WOFF and OFF2 format, but there are a number of additional ones. And so if you would look at the CSS code that you find in many websites, you will see CSS elements like this font face thing, and then you will see a number of different URLs. And that is because the website can't know which browser you're going to use to look at it. And so they build in some kind of a fail safe. Yeah. So in this case, the CSS file says, I would prefer that you use this WOFF2 format. But if you don't support that, then I also have the older version for you. And you could actually enter, or you could actually add a number of additional rules to this list, with different file formats that are supported and so on. what you're dealing with here is a cChip, and the cChip engine is built on WebKit, and so there are not 1,500 different browsers. You know exactly which browser there is, and it is the version of WebKit that is integrated in the cChip technology. And so you don't have to supply a number of different online font formats. Actually, in fact, you don't have to supply an online font format at all. You can just use OpenType fonts. Yeah. So I can have a source URL, and I think I have an example of that as well. You can have a source URL that just points to an OpenType font file or a TrueType font file that lives on your system, and that works just fine, right? And you know that if it works during testing, it will also work in production because you know what browser is going to be used. So that is much simpler in the in our templates than it is just in the internet or on the internet in general. And then the last point here is a bit of, and we will encounter that, I'm sure. Image support is also slightly different. Again, different browsers support different things. For example, there are browsers, I know Safari does it, that support some CMYK image formats. Other browsers don't. And there may be similar differences. Again, you only have one browser here, so that is one difference. The other difference is that the cChip engine has built-in support, better built-in support for PDF. And so if the example of the invoice again, if I want to make an invoice, I can say, I want a logo on there. Well, in the cChip template, I can specify the image for the logo as a PDF file. So I can have the URL to a PDF file rather than a JPEG or a PNG or whatever. And all of the advanced functionality that I have in that PDF that I point to is going to be retained. In fact, the content of that PDF is just merged into the final output document. So if I have a logo that uses spot colors and all kinds of complex types of transparency and so on, and overprint and whatever, if that logo in PDF has been set up correctly, then I can just point to it. And all of these advanced settings are ending up in the output PDF. You can also choose which page is included, which is nice. So I could have one PDF with a bunch of stuff in it, and then when I use it in HTML, I can tell it which page I want to include. And you can choose which part of the page is included. So I could say I want to add a preview of my production document. So maybe I want to show everything inside of the bleed box or everything inside of the trim box, regardless. And you can use a part of that. So I not only I want to show the trim box, but I could also say I want to see part of the trim box from 5 centimeter on the left, 10 centimeter wide, and then something with height as well. Yeah? So you have a bunch more capabilities there than you would have in a typical HTML template for a website or HTML code for a website. You have some more freedom there. And I would suggest you use it when you can use it for things like logos. In general, it is better to include a high quality PDF content than it would be to include a low res PNG of these things. So if you want to do that, then you can, and it is done with standard image links. And there is documentation on how to specify the page box and so on, and we can talk about all of that a little bit later when we start playing with an actual template. But for now, just know that these things are available. So let me go back to Visual Studio Code for just a second, and then we're done, I think, unless there are questions. But this CSS folder that I have here is part of the template for a template for a template. It actually is. There is, and I'll talk about that next time, I think, on GitHub, there are examples for place content, for example, templates for place content, and there is a relatively complex, some people would tell me, template that you can use and get started from, and it has some HTML for you, it has some CSS, and it has some JavaScript that you can just use. This CSS code is part of that. And so the first one that I wanted to show is this cleanup thing. This does what I just said about the rules sometimes being annoying. So it sets the margin and the padding to 0 for all elements. Remark that the rule here starts with an asterisk, and that actually means all elements you can think of. Yeah, so we're applying this rule to everything in our HTML, unless, of course, later on we override it. Cascading style sheets. I'm setting the margin to 0, but if I now want to add a P element where I set the margin to 10 millimeter on the left-hand side, then I can certainly do that. So everything's set to 0, and then I set box sizing to what I think is the more logical of the two possibilities, and I set the background color of all elements to transparent. And that doesn't mean that transparency is going to be generated by that. What it means is that, like the example with the box that I have or had, that it is not going to give me a white RGB background in my output. And then an example of the way to specify fonts. So much simpler than what you would typically see on a website. And as I said, it can refer to an actual font file, an open type font file or a true type font file. In this case, I have a true type font file. This is not a full example because look at the URL. It's a relative URL. I can assure you that that font folder does not exist where this URL is pointing to. But if you would look at the whole template on GitHub, then of course it would. Yeah, but so what we're saying here is that whenever I use the font in CSS, when I say that the font family should be free universal and the font weight and font style should be normal, then this is the font file that is going to be used. But if in my CSS I say that I want to use italic, then the italic version of the font file is going to be used. So you can specify as many of these rules as you want, but you don't have to have the sensitivity to include 5 different formats to cater for multiple browsers. You can just point to a true type file or an open type file. And the easiest is that you make a font folder somewhere in the template, and then you put those font files in there, and your URL would point to these files. Can you use fonts that are online? Many websites don't have the fonts on the server, but they refer to something from Google or someone else that hosts these font files somewhere for people to use. Yes, you can do that, but then we will have to talk about security and speed. Of course, that would mean that you make now a template that would reach out to the internet and download those fonts. And that is probably not what you want in a production workflow. And for example, in pdfChip, I'm actually not sure about pdfToolbox, but in pdfChip, I think by default, you cannot refer to content that is online. You would have to switch that on. There is a command line parameter that lets you say, it's fine for my template to request information on the internet. And that is, of course, done not just for performance reasons, but also for security reasons. And then I will show you very briefly this file, and we're going to come back to that. But I talked in the beginning about extensions to some of these file formats. Well, this is an example of such an extension. So in a normal website world, I cannot have the text as CMYK black, for example, but the cChip engine understands a special CSS property called cChip CMYK, and that I can use to specify CMYK, or I could specify a spot color with it, or any other type of more advanced element, right? And there's a whole bunch of them. There is documentation for them, but for now, just know that you are not limited to what you can do in the web browser. There are extensions, and this cChip prefix is how they are typically formed. That has a reason. It allows the browser, if you use the same code in a browser, it allows the browser to ignore these things without giving warnings. But you can do these things, and that allows you to generate print production files in the end. So if you wonder whether you're going to have to live without having access to CMYK or spot colors or ICC-based color spaces or anything like that, then the answer is no. You just have to make sure that you use the correct CSS tags.